Since Stein and I had that conversation about the faces in my painting, I've done a little research and quite a bit of thinking and a lot more talking with Stein. And a lot of surprising things had come out of that. The first surprising thing to me was how easy it was to find examples of incorrect eyes in the masters. And I knew I would find them, but what I did when I wanted to find an example is I went and I grabbed a Raphael book and I opened it up, and right away there it was, and I turned every page and I found them everywhere. And I selected some more egregious examples, but it's not just Raphael, it's everybody. The conversation with Stein evolved in a certain way, and the idea was, well, okay, maybe the old masters did it, but when they did it, like when Picasso did it, there was a whole context and it made sense. And when it happened with the old masters, they were using certain formulas. But somehow I was in a separate category, a special category. It wasn't like the modernists because they were having a special context, and it wasn't like the old masters because they were doing things in a certain way. But somehow my faces are bad for some kind of special reason. What does that mean? What's going on? And I'm still thinking my way into this, but I think it may have something to do with my age and the situation of my youth. I was born in the 50s, and very young. We were living in New York. My father's a painter. All our friends were painters and artists. And I was free at the age of 7 I was going to a school on 79th off Madison Avenue. And after school, I could go around the corner and go to the galleries, or I could just walk up the street, walk up Fifth Avenue and go to the Met. Or I could go play in the park, and I would do one of those three things after school for years. So not only in my home and homes of the friends of my parents, not only there, but in the galleries and in the museum, I was exposed to what turned out to be a moment before the emergence of contemporary art, and then the emergence of contemporary art. To me, it was simply a spectacle. And then I was aware of the fatwa against representational painting, which was really a fatwa against all the old painting. Everything had to be abstract painting. And that was recently confirmed to me. A few years ago, I visited Jane DiResta, the widow of Robert DiResta. And I talked about that, and she confirmed to me that it had been very rough, and that, I'd known that Bob had left New York more or less because of that, but she confirmed that. There was a radical shift in what was going on in the art world in New York, and all the artists who were having success at that time, like my father, he was having a modest success. He had a good gallery, and he was having shows and so on. And a whole bunch of other painters, that was over for them. And it became all about abstract expressionism, and then contemporary art emerged, and the whole situation changed. So I lived through that, but the point is that I grew up with expressionism. I grew up with, and also those people who were painting basically in expressionist and surrealist manners, like my father and like everybody else, they were all for the old masters. They were. Well, Aaron said it. I want the new, but I want the old. And that was the attitude. So that's the attitude I grew up with. And then, in my struggle to be able to, I guess you could say, paint like the old masters. But it wasn't that I wanted to imitate any particular painter so much as I just felt in what I did that I couldn't do what I wanted to do, and I needed something to help me be able to do this. And so I struggled to figure that out. And I, of course, as I've mentioned, I had the luck to have certain good teachers, particularly Aaron Curzon, so that I got a lot of the old education. But I didn't get that old education in the old situation. It was now the new situation. The new situation of the underlying contemporary art thing where, everybody does their own thing. And people like my father and Aaron Curzon, they weren't opposed to that. They were accepting of that, and my father and Aaron Curzon in particular did interesting things in that mode of doing things that are that break out of the old categories and make art out of surprising new things. And I was into that, or it was okay with me, but I wanted to paint, which they did too. I mean, my father spent most of his time painting, and Aaron, painting was always his thing. So, but it was this different atmosphere. So it was a result. In spite of my good education, which was a great help, there was more that had to be figured out. And eventually, what I'm getting at is this, that eventually the way I was able to get at it was by working my way back through modernism, back to the old masters. And to give an example of how that works, if you go back from Cubism, this is, a very crude example, but if you go back from Cubism, with a certain understanding of Cubism, I got into painting Cubism for a while as part of this education I wanted to give myself. And if you go back from Cubism to the old masters, then you can see that Boucher is, if not the father of the Cubists, the great-grandfather of the Cubists. If you can understand Boucher in terms of Cubism and Expressionism, then you really see what's going on. And then you start to be able to see how Boucher is doing what he's doing. Boucher, for example, because I always use Boucher because he's a very clear example, but there's plenty of other examples, and you can come at this from all different kinds of directions. So my painting has in it, it's not a synthesis of modernism and old masters, but I don't make a radical separation between, say, Cubism and Boucher. And that doesn't mean that I want to put in Picasso eyes all over the place. It doesn't mean that. It just means that I just can't be as shocked by those sorts of errors. For Stein, this misplaced eye, this conversation has had some effect on him, but okay, so there's a misplaced eye, and at the beginning of our conversation, the eye being out of place just wrecked it. It was terrible. And then it turns out that all the old masters, it doesn't wreck it in their case. So there's something about my work, and I think it has to do with how today people younger than myself and people who didn't have that early experience of absorbing the old atmosphere of the people who were born in the 20s, the 10s, 20s, and 30s, who were the people who formed my attitudes. Younger people who now want to paint, so they have an impulse to be like the old masters, and then when they enter the world as young people, right away they hit the wall of contemporary art. What's the result? So one result, you get a lot of these classical realists who think about nothing but accuracy. You hear Damien Chavez can't, to him, and he's not the only one. A lot of these classical realists have this kind of violent rejection of my stuff because it doesn't have this accuracy, and accuracy and illusion and realisticness become the complete virtue. And Chavez will say things like, El Greco is a terrible painter, and the only reason anybody likes El Greco or says they like El Greco is because it's an excuse for doing sloppy work. None of the old masters were, even Bouguereau. I mean, he's not an old master really, but even the neoclassics, they especially Ingres, were not obsessed with these things that have become these terrible errors, and always practiced modifications and interpretations and expressive things that they were doing with their subjects. Art is artificial. There's some difficulty given the experience of younger people who are interested in painting today. There's an aspect of their experience that makes this complicated, and there's aspects of my experience that make it hard for me to appreciate and sympathize with their attitudes.